Hi, I'm Maya Chen. During Thanksgiving dinner, my Uncle Rick called my environmental science degree worthless and said I should have learned a real trade instead. What he didn't expect was that 3 days later, his assistant would be begging me to save his construction company from a $2 million EPA fine. But that moment at the dinner table wasn't just cruel words over turkey. It was the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling between us for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The desert heat had finally broken by November, and Phoenix felt almost livable again. I was sitting in my downtown loft apartment, surrounded by the kind of greenery that made people think I was crazy for keeping so many plants in Arizona. Succulents lined my windowsills, snake plants stretched toward my high ceilings, and my prized fiddle-leaf fig stood guard by the sliding door to my tiny balcony. Each plant was a small rebellion against the concrete landscape outside, much like my career choice had been a rebellion against my family's expectations. At 26, I had built something I was proud of. My environmental science degree, the one that had cost me 3 jobs and countless sleepless nights to earn, had landed me a position at Rodriguez Sustainability Consulting. We specialized in helping businesses navigate environmental regulations, conduct soil assessments, and achieve green building certifications. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Every contaminated site we cleaned up, every building we made more energy efficient, every EPA compliance issue we resolved felt like a small victory for the planet. My phone buzzed with the group text I had been dreading all week. Mom's message was characteristically direct. "Maya, you're bringing dessert for Thursday, right? And please wear something nice. Uncle Rick is bringing potential investors to dinner." I stared at the message, already feeling the familiar knot forming in my chest. Thanksgiving with the Thompson side of the family was always a performance, and I was perpetually cast as the disappointment. The drive from Phoenix to Tucson took exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes, a journey I had made countless times but never looked forward to. The desert landscape shifted subtly as I drove south, the saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels against the pale blue sky. My Honda Civic was loaded with organic pumpkin cheesecake from my favorite bakery, the kind that cost twice what a homemade dessert would but tasted like autumn should. I had learned years ago that bringing something store-bought saved me from the inevitable critiques of my cooking skills, though it never saved me from criticism entirely. Uncle Rick's house sat in a subdivision that had been built when Tucson was expanding rapidly in the early 2000s. Ranch-style homes with red tile roofs and xeriscaped front yards that required minimal water but maximum maintenance. His driveway was already crowded with familiar vehicles: Dad's silver pickup truck, Cousin Tyler's lifted Jeep, and a sleek black BMW that I didn't recognize, but assumed belonged to one of Rick's business associates. The smell of roasting turkey and simmering pozole greeted me as I walked through the front door, carrying my dessert contribution. Aunt Carol had outdone herself with the decorations, mixing traditional autumn colors with papel picado in vibrant blues and greens, a nod to Mom's Mexican heritage that Rick tolerated but never fully embraced. The house buzzed with conversation in both English and Spanish, generations of our family weaving between languages as easily as they moved between the kitchen and living room. Mom appeared at my elbow almost immediately, her expression mixing relief and anxiety. "Maya, mija, you made it. Your dad was worried about the drive." She lowered her voice. "Rick's been talking business all afternoon with those investors. Try to steer clear of work talk, okay?" I nodded, understanding the subtext. Try to be invisible. Try not to remind everyone that you chose a career Rick doesn't understand or respect. The living room was arranged for maximum conversation, couches, and chairs forming a circle that felt more like an interrogation setup than a family gathering. Uncle Rick commanded the center seat, a beer in one hand and a football game playing softly in the background. At 52, he still carried himself like the high school linebacker he had once been, all broad shoulders and confident posture. His construction company, Thompson & Sons, had made him wealthy by Arizona standards, and he never let anyone forget it. Tyler waved me over to the kitchen where the younger cousins were assembled, including Ashley, whose presence always made these gatherings more bearable. She worked as a teacher in Phoenix, and we had bonded over being the family members who chose careers in service rather than profit. "How's the environmental consulting?" she asked, genuine interest in her voice. "Still saving the world one soil sample at a time?" Before I could answer, Rick's voice boomed from the living room. "Maya, come over here and meet some real business people." The way he emphasized real made my skin crawl, but I plastered on a smile and walked toward the group. Two men in expensive polo shirts sat across from Rick, their conversation pausing. As I approached, "This is my niece Maya," Rick announced, gesturing toward me with his beer bottle. "She went to college for dirt science or something like that." One of the investors, a balding man with kind eyes, seemed genuinely interested. "Environmental science? That's fascinating. The construction industry is having to adapt to so many new regulations these days." I felt a spark of hope. Maybe someone here would actually want to hear about my work. Yes, I specialize in contamination assessment and remediation, plus green building certifications. It's amazing how much we can do to minimize environmental impact while still meeting development needs. Rick's laugh cut through my explanation like a rusty blade. "Environmental impact," he repeated, shaking his head. "Maya here thinks we should ask permission from every lizard and cactus before we build anything. In my day, we just moved the dirt and got to work." The investors chuckled politely, the kind of laugh that men share when they want to avoid conflict but don't necessarily disagree. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt my cheeks burning but kept my voice steady. Actually, environmental regulations help protect property values and prevent costly cleanup projects down the line. I've seen developments lose millions because they didn't do proper soil testing up front. Rick waved dismissively. "That's just government overreach, sweetheart. Real business is about taking risks and making things happen, not hiding behind regulations and paperwork." The conversation moved on, but Rick's words echoed in my head throughout dinner. As we gathered around Carol's beautifully set table, complete with hand-painted ceramic plates and cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles, I found myself seated between Tyler and Grandma Helen, safely away from Rick's direct line of fire. The food was incredible, a fusion of Carol's traditional recipes and Mom's Mexican influences that should have been the focus of our gratitude. Instead, Rick dominated the conversation with stories of his latest projects, his voice growing louder. With each beer, "We're building the future of Tucson," he declared, gesturing broadly enough to nearly knock over his wine glass. "None of this environmental red tape nonsense, just good old-fashioned American construction." One of the investors asked about permitting processes, and Rick launched into a tirade about government bureaucracy that made my stomach turn. When Grandma Helen tried to change the subject by asking about my work, I felt a moment of hope. "Maya's always been so smart," she said, her weathered hand patting mine. "Tell us about your job, mija." I began explaining a recent project where we had helped a developer transform a contaminated brownfield site into affordable housing, but Rick interrupted before I could finish. "That's the problem with your generation," he said, pointing his fork at me. "Always making things complicated. You spend 4 years and thousands of dollars learning how to make simple things difficult." His words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. "Sometimes what looks simple on the surface has complex implications underneath," I replied quietly. Rick's voice rose. "Complex implications. You know what's complex? Running a real business, employing real people, building things that matter, not sitting in some office writing reports about dirt." The table fell silent except for the scraping of silverware against plates. Mom's face was tight with embarrassment, and Dad stared intently at his pozole as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Environmental science isn't just about dirt, Uncle Rick," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "It's about understanding how human activity affects ecosystems, how to build sustainably, how to prevent contamination that can cost millions to clean up later." Rick leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "See what I mean? Making simple things complicated. In my day, we called that dirt. We moved it, and we built something useful on top of it." The investor with kind eyes tried to mediate. "Both perspectives have value in today's market," he said diplomatically. But Rick was on a roll now, fueled by beer and the attention of his audience. "Maya here spent more money on her degree than most people make in 2 years. And for what? To tell people they can't build where they want to build? That's not a career, that's an obstacle." I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. "I'm sorry you see environmental protection as an obstacle," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've always seen it as an investment in the future." Rick's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Investment in the future? Maya, sweetheart, your degree is worthless. You should have learned a real trade, something that actually contributes to society instead of standing in the way of progress." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, poisonous and inescapable. Worthless. My degree, my career, my passion, my identity, all of it reduced to a single, devastating word. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to speak, up to defend me, to acknowledge that Rick had crossed a line. Instead, I saw averted eyes and uncomfortable silence. Even Ashley, usually my ally, seemed frozen by the intensity of Rick's attack. I set down my napkin with deliberate care and stood up slowly. "Thank you for dinner, Aunt Carol. The pozole was delicious." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm and too controlled. "I think I should head back to Phoenix before it gets too late." Mom started to protest, but I was already moving toward the door, grabbing my purse and keys with mechanical precision. The drive back to Phoenix passed in a blur of desert highway and scattered thoughts. I didn't cry, though. I felt like I should. Instead, I felt empty, hollowed out like a gourd left too long in the sun. Rick's words played on repeat in my mind, mixing with memories of other family gatherings where my choices had been questioned, my achievements minimized, my worth measured against standards I could never meet. By the time I reached my apartment, the familiar sight of my plants and the city lights twinkling beyond my windows felt like a sanctuary. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of wine, settling onto my couch with my laptop. Work emails waited in my inbox, project updates and client requests that reminded me that my degree might be worthless to Uncle Rick, but it paid my bills and gave my life meaning. One email caught my attention, marked urgent, and sent just an hour ago. The subject line read, "Emergency consultation request, Thompson and Sons Construction." My breath caught in my throat as I opened the message. It was from Jennifer Walsh, identified as Rick's executive assistant, and her desperation leaked through every carefully worded sentence. "Ms. Chen, we received your contact information from the Arizona Environmental Consultants Directory. Thompson and Sons Construction is facing an urgent compliance issue that requires immediate expert attention. We understand you specialize in soil contamination assessment and EPA regulations. Could you please call my direct line as soon as possible? We are prepared to discuss emergency consulting rates for weekend availability." I stared at the screen, reading the email 3 times before the irony fully settled in. Thompson and Sons Construction, Rick's company. The same Rick who had called my degree worthless not 4 hours earlier was now desperately seeking the exact expertise he had dismissed. I reached for my phone, then stopped. Something about this felt too convenient, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Instead of calling immediately, I did what any good environmental scientist would do. I researched. A quick search of public records revealed that Thompson & Sons had received a notice of violation from the EPA just yesterday, Black Friday, while families across America were shopping for bargains. The violation was related to their biggest current project, a mixed-use development called Desert Vista Commons that was supposed to include retail, office space, and luxury condos. According to the public filing, soil testing at the Desert Vista site had revealed contamination levels that exceeded EPA standards, likely from historical industrial use. The notice gave Thompson & Sons 30 days to submit a remediation plan or face fines starting at $50,000 per day. Worse, the contamination appeared to affect wetlands that were protected under federal law, which could result in criminal charges if not handled properly. I leaned back against my couch cushions, wine glass forgotten in my hand. This wasn't just a compliance issue or a minor regulatory hurdle. This was a company-ending crisis that required exactly the kind of expertise Rick had spent the evening mocking. Soil contamination assessment, wetlands protection, EPA compliance, remediation planning. Every aspect of the problem fell squarely within my specialty area. My phone rang, startling me out of my research. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Maya Chen speaking. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and barely contained panic. Ms. Chen, this is Jennifer Walsh from Thompson & Sons Construction. Thank you so much for taking my call. I know it's late, but we have an emergency situation that requires immediate environmental consulting expertise. I let her explain the situation, listening as she described the EPA violation, the contamination discovery, and the 30-day deadline with the kind of technical accuracy that suggested she had been researching environmental law all day. We need someone who can conduct additional soil testing, prepare a remediation plan, and guide us through the EPA compliance process, she continued. Your name came up as one of the top environmental consultants in Arizona with specific experience in this type of contamination. When she paused for my response, I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Are you aware that Rick Thompson is my uncle? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jennifer's voice returned, smaller and more uncertain. No, I wasn't aware of that relationship. Does that present a conflict of interest for you? I considered the question seriously. From a professional standpoint, there was no conflict. I had never worked for Thompson & Sons, had no financial interest in the company, and my expertise was exactly what they needed. From a personal standpoint, the conflict was enormous, tangled up in years of family dynamics and an evening's worth of fresh humiliation. Not professionally, I answered carefully. But I should mention that my uncle and I had a disagreement about the value of environmental science just this evening. Jennifer's sigh was audible through the phone. Ms. Chen, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Mr. Thompson is facing the biggest crisis in his company's history. If we don't resolve this EPA violation, we're looking at daily fines that will bankrupt us within months, plus potential criminal charges. I've contacted every environmental consultant in Arizona, and you're the only one with availability and the specific expertise we need for this type of contamination. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. I don't know what kind of disagreement you had with Mr. Thompson, but right now, you might be the only person who can save his company. We're prepared to pay emergency consulting, rates, including weekend and holiday premiums. All I'm asking is that you consider helping us, regardless of any personal issues. I found myself admiring Jennifer's directness and her willingness to acknowledge the awkwardness of the situation. She was clearly competent and professional, probably one of the reasons Rick's company had survived as long as it had. I'll need to review all the documentation before I can commit to anything, I told her. Can you email me the EPA notice, the soil testing results, and any other relevant environmental reports? Relief flooded her voice. Yes, absolutely. I can have everything to you within the hour. Ms. Chen, I can't tell you how much this means to us. Mr. Thompson doesn't know I'm contacting you specifically. I found your information through the consultant directory and didn't realize the family connection until you mentioned it. Should I tell him? The question hung between us like a spider's web, delicate and potentially dangerous. Let me review the documents first, I said finally. We can discuss next steps once I understand the full scope of the problem. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's silence, city lights painting patterns on my walls through the blinds. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Uncle Rick, who had spent the evening dismissing environmental science as worthless government overreach, was now facing the very real consequences of ignoring environmental regulations. His company was in crisis because they had failed to do the proper soil testing before breaking ground, exactly the kind of oversight that environmental consultants existed to prevent. I opened my laptop and waited for Jennifer's email, knowing that once I read those documents, I would have to make a choice that would define not just my relationship with Rick, but my understanding of my own professional ethics and personal boundaries. Outside my window, Phoenix spread out like a circuit board, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one touching the environment in ways both subtle and profound. My degree might be worthless to Uncle Rick, but in a few hours, it might be the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. The desert had taught me patience, and my plants had taught me that growth sometimes requires difficult conditions. As I waited for the email that would change everything, I realized that this moment had been building for years, through every family gathering where I had been dismissed, every conversation where my expertise had been minimized, every time I had chosen silence over confrontation. The email arrived at 11:47 p.m., marked urgent and containing 6 attachments. As I began to read, the scope of Thompson & Sons crisis became clear, and with it, the perfect, terrible irony of Uncle Rick's situation. My worthless degree was about to become his lifeline, and I was the only one who could decide whether to throw it to him or let him drown in the consequences of his own arrogance. The contamination was worse than I had initially understood, affecting not just soil but groundwater systems that connected to protected wetlands. The potential fines weren't just financial, they were criminal, with jail time possible for company executives who knowingly violated environmental protection laws. As I read through the technical reports and legal documents, one thing became crystal clear. Rick Thompson needed me more than he had ever needed anyone in his life, and he didn't even know it yet. The weekend passed slowly, each hour marked by my deliberate avoidance of both family phone calls and the growing stack of environmental reports spread across my dining table. Saturday morning brought 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Ashley, and a single text from Dad that simply read, "Call your mother." I turned my phone face down and focused instead on the technical data that painted a devastating picture of Uncle Rick's situation. The contamination at Desert Vista Commons wasn't just extensive, it was the kind of environmental disaster that made headlines and ended careers. Historical records showed the site had housed a dry cleaning facility in the 1970s, back when environmental regulations were suggestions rather than requirements. Decades of tetrachloroethylene had seeped into the soil, creating a plume of contamination that stretched beneath the construction site and into the adjacent wetlands preserve. What made Rick's situation truly catastrophic was the timing. Thompson & Sons had broken ground without conducting proper Phase 2 environmental testing, a shortcut that saved them maybe $20,000 up front, but now threatened to cost them everything. The EPA's preliminary assessment suggested remediation costs alone could exceed $2 million, assuming they could even get permits to disturb the contaminated soil near protected wetlands. I spread the site maps across my kitchen island, tracing the contamination boundaries with my finger. 3 different government agencies had jurisdiction over various aspects of the problem: the EPA for soil contamination, the Army Corps of Engineers for wetlands impact, and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality for groundwater protection. Navigating the bureaucratic maze would require someone with extensive experience in multi-agency coordination, someone who understood both the technical requirements and the political sensitivities involved. Someone exactly like me. My phone buzzed with another call from Jennifer Walsh. I had been expecting her follow-up since Friday night, but somehow I still wasn't prepared for the desperation in her voice when I answered. Ms. Chen, thank you for taking my call. I know you said you needed time to review the documents, but I have to ask, is there any possibility you can help us? The situation has gotten worse since we last spoke. I settled into my desk chair, surrounded by environmental regulations printed out and highlighted in multiple colors. Worse how? Jennifer's sigh carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept in days. We received another notice yesterday, this time from the Army Corps of Engineers. Apparently, our construction activities have impacted wetlands that weren't properly delineated in our original surveys. They're threatening to issue a cease and desist order for the entire project. The implications hit me immediately. A cease and desist from the Corps would shut down construction completely, leaving Rick with a partially built development that he couldn't finish and couldn't sell. The carrying costs alone would bankrupt most construction companies within months. Have you hired legal counsel? I asked, already knowing the answer would complicate things further. Mr. Thompson retained Morrison and Associates yesterday, Jennifer replied. But their environmental law specialist says we need technical expertise before they can advise us on legal strategy. The contamination assessment, the remediation planning, the permit applications, they need someone who can speak the EPA's language and understand the science behind the regulations. I found myself nodding even though she couldn't see me. Environmental law was complex precisely because it sat at the intersection of science, regulation, and politics. Lawyers could navigate the legal framework, but they needed technical experts to translate the science into language that regulators and courts could understand. Jennifer, I need to ask you something directly. Does Rick know you're calling me specifically, or does he just know you're looking for environmental consultants? The pause was long enough to answer my question before she spoke. He knows I'm pursuing every possible option for technical assistance. I haven't mentioned your name specifically because, honestly, I'm not sure how he would react, given whatever happened between you two on Thursday. She took a breath before continuing. Ms. Chen, I've worked for Mr. Thompson for 8 years. I've seen him navigate financial crises, labor disputes, and regulatory challenges. I've never seen him this scared. Something in her voice made me sit up straighter. Jennifer wasn't just Rick's assistant. She was clearly someone he trusted with the most sensitive aspects of his business. If she was reaching out to me despite not knowing our family connection, it meant she had exhausted other options and was genuinely desperate. What exactly did he tell you about environmental consultants? I asked. That they're usually government. Bureaucrats who couldn't make it in real business, Jennifer replied, and I could hear the embarrassment in her voice. He said we needed to find someone who understood how to work with regulators without getting caught up in environmental activism. Someone practical who could solve problems instead of creating them. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Rick wanted someone practical and business-focused, someone who understood regulatory requirements without being an environmental activist, someone exactly like me, whose approach to environmental consulting was built on finding solutions that worked for both business interests and environmental protection. Jennifer, I'm going to be completely honest with you about what happened Thursday night. I told her about the Thanksgiving dinner, Rick's dismissal of my degree as worthless, his characterization of environmental science as government overreach, standing in the way of progress. I described his contempt for regulations and his belief that environmental consultants were obstacles rather than solutions. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or dismay. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if I had lost her. Finally, she spoke, her voice careful and measured. Ms. Chen, I'm not going to lie and say that doesn't sound like Mr. Thompson. He has very strong opinions about government regulation, and he doesn't always express them diplomatically. But I've also seen him adapt when reality doesn't match his expectations. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Right now, reality is telling him that his approach to environmental issues might have been short-sighted. The question is whether he's willing to swallow his pride long enough to accept help from someone whose expertise he previously dismissed. And honestly, whether you're willing to help someone who hurt you personally. The question hung between us, cutting straight to the heart of my dilemma. Could I separate my professional obligations from my personal feelings? More importantly, should I? Jennifer, if I were to consider taking this project, I would need complete authority over the environmental aspects. No second-guessing my recommendations, no shortcuts to save money, no interference from Rick's opinions about environmental regulations. Done, she replied without hesitation. Ms. Chen, if you can get us through this crisis, you can have whatever authority you need. Mr. Thompson is facing the possibility of losing everything he's built over the past 20 years. I think he's reached the point where he'll accept help from anyone who can provide it, regardless of his personal feelings. I looked around my apartment, at the plants that thrived under my care, at the environmental science textbooks that lined my shelves, at the framed certificates that documented my expertise in exactly the areas Rick's company needed. I'll need to see the site personally before I can commit to anything. Can you arrange access for Monday morning? Relief flooded Jennifer's voice. Yes, absolutely. Should I tell Mr. Thompson you're coming, or would you prefer to handle that conversation yourself? The question forced me to confront the reality of walking back into Rick's orbit after Thursday night's humiliation. I think it's better if he knows ahead of time. But Jennifer, I want to be clear about something. I'm considering this project because I believe I can help solve a serious environmental problem. If Rick can't work with me professionally, regardless of our personal history, then this arrangement won't work for anyone. I understand completely, Jennifer replied. I'll speak with him first thing Monday morning and make sure he understands the situation. Ms. Chen, I can't thank you enough for even considering this. You might be the only person who can save his company. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's quiet, processing the decision I had just made. In less than a week, I had gone from being dismissed as an obstacle to progress to potentially being Rick's only salvation. The shift felt surreal, like waking up to discover the world had flipped upside down overnight. Sunday brought a call from Ashley, whose concern was evident from her first words. Maya, what happened Thursday night? Mom said you left early and Uncle Rick has been in a terrible mood ever since. Tyler mentioned something about business problems, but no one wants to talk about it. I found myself caught between family loyalty and professional confidentiality, unsure how much I could or should reveal. Rick and I had a disagreement about my career, I said carefully. As for his business problems, you'd have to ask him about that. Ashley wasn't easily deflected. Maya, I know Uncle Rick can be difficult, especially about things he doesn't understand. But he's family, and he's in real trouble right now. Whatever he said Thursday night, maybe this is a chance to move past it. Her words stuck with me as I prepared for Monday's site visit. Ashley was right that Rick was family, and family relationships were complicated in ways that business relationships never were. But she was also asking me to overlook not just Thursday night's humiliation, but years of similar dismissals and diminishments. Could I do that? More importantly, should I? Monday morning dawned clear and cold, typical for December in the desert. I dressed carefully in field clothes, sturdy boots, khaki pants, a long-sleeved shirt, and a baseball cap to shield my face from the sun. My truck was loaded with soil sampling equipment, pH meters, and a field kit for preliminary contamination testing. If I was going to assess the Desert Vista Commons site, I would do it thoroughly and professionally. The drive to the construction site took me through parts of Tucson I rarely visited, newer developments built on former ranch land where master-planned communities sprawled across the desert floor. Desert Vista Commons sat on a prominent rise, overlooking the city, its location chosen for views and prestige rather than environmental suitability. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rick had selected one of the most environmentally sensitive sites in the area for his biggest development project. Jennifer met me at the site entrance, her professional demeanor unchanged from our phone conversations. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent time on construction sites. "Ms. Chen, thank you so much for coming. Mr. Thompson is..." waiting in the site trailer. The construction trailer sat at the edge of the development, surrounded by equipment that had been idle since the EPA notice arrived. Excavators and bulldozers sat silent, their operators reassigned to other projects, while Thompson and Sons figured out their next move. The partially completed buildings looked like abandoned monuments to misplaced ambition, their concrete foundations exposed to the elements. Rick was studying blueprints when Jennifer and I entered the trailer, his reading glasses perched on his nose and his expression grim. He looked up as we approached, and I watched recognition and surprise cross his face. In quick succession, "Maya," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Jennifer mentioned you might be able to help us with our environmental situation." The understatement was almost laughable. Environmental situation, as if facing $2 million in fines and potential criminal charges was a minor inconvenience. "Hello, Uncle Rick," I replied, matching his neutral tone. "I understand Thompson and Sons is dealing with some contamination issues." We stood there looking at each other, the weight of Thursday night's confrontation hanging between us like a heavy curtain. Jennifer cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should start with a site tour so Ms. Chen can see the areas of concern?" Rick nodded, grabbing a hard hat from the hook by the door. "Maya, you'll need one of these. OSHA requirements." He handed me the bright yellow helmet, and for a moment our hands touched as I took it. His skin was rougher than I remembered, weathered by decades of construction work. The contamination was worse than the reports had indicated. Standing at the edge of the excavation, I could see the telltale signs of chlorinated solvent contamination in the soil discoloration and the chemical odor that hung in the air. The contaminated area extended well beyond the initial assessment boundaries, spreading toward the wetlands preserve in patterns that suggested decades of underground migration. "When did you first notice the discoloration?" I asked, crouching, down to examine the soil more closely. Rick shifted uncomfortably behind me. "We hit a pocket of weird-smelling dirt about 3 weeks ago. The foreman thought it was just old garbage or something. We kept digging until the EPA showed up with their testing equipment." I stood up, brushing soil from my hands. 3 weeks of continued excavation had made the contamination problem exponentially worse, spreading contaminated soil throughout the construction site and potentially releasing volatile compounds into the air. "Did anyone test the air quality for workers during those 3 weeks?" Rick's silence answered my question. The wetlands impact was equally serious. Construction activities had disturbed the natural water flow patterns, causing contaminated groundwater to seep into areas that should have remained pristine. The Army Corps of Engineers had jurisdiction over wetlands protection, and their penalties could be even more severe than the EPA's. "Uncle Rick, this isn't just a contamination problem. This is a multi-agency enforcement action that could result in criminal charges." His face paled as I explained the legal implications. Federal environmental crimes carried serious penalties, including potential jail time for company executives who knowingly violated environmental laws. Even if Rick claimed ignorance of the contamination, the fact that Thompson and Sons had continued construction after discovering the contaminated soil could be interpreted as willful violation of environmental regulations. "What do you recommend?" he asked, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. The man who had dismissed my degree as worthless 4 days earlier was now asking for my professional opinion on a crisis that threatened everything he had built. First, we need to stop all construction activities immediately and secure the site to prevent further contamination spread. Then we need comprehensive soil and groundwater testing to determine the full extent of the problem. I walked him through the remediation process step by step: contamination delineation, risk assessment, remediation design, regulatory approval, implementation, and long-term monitoring. Each phase would require specialized expertise and significant financial investment. Realistically, you're looking at 18 to 24 months for complete remediation, assuming we can get all the necessary permits and approvals. Rick leaned against his pickup truck, suddenly looking every one of his 52 years. How much? The question was barely audible, but I heard the desperation underneath. Conservatively, $2 to $3 million for remediation alone. That doesn't include legal fees, construction delays, or potential fines and penalties. His face went gray, and for a moment, I thought he might be sick. Jennifer stepped forward, her voice steady despite the devastating news. Ms. Chen, if you were to take this project, where would you start? It was the right question, focusing on solutions rather than problems. I would start with an emergency response plan to prevent further contamination spread, followed by comprehensive site characterization to understand exactly what we're dealing with. But I need to be clear about something. I looked directly at Rick, making sure he understood what I was about to say. If I take this project, I will run the environmental aspects exactly as I see fit. No shortcuts, no corner cutting, no second-guessing my recommendations because they cost money or take time. The only way through this crisis is complete compliance with all applicable regulations, which means doing everything by the book. Rick stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Pride versus survival, skepticism versus desperation, his preconceptions about environmental regulations versus the reality of his situation. Finally, he nodded slowly. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Can you actually fix this? The question was asked without his usual bluster or condescension, just a man facing the possible destruction of his life's work. I can't promise to fix it, I replied honestly, but I can promise to give you the best possible chance of getting through it. The contamination is serious, the regulatory situation is complex, and the financial implications are severe. But it's not hopeless, assuming we act quickly and professionally. He extended his hand and I took it, feeling the calluses earned through decades of construction work. Then I guess we're working together, he said. Jennifer will get you whatever you need. Just remember, Maya, this company employs 43 people. Their jobs depend on us finding a way through this mess. The reminder of the human cost behind the environmental crisis hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about Rick's pride or my professional vindication. It was about families who depended on Thompson & Sons for their livelihoods, about a community development that could provide housing and commercial space, about finding a balance between environmental protection and economic necessity. As I drove back to Phoenix that afternoon, my truck loaded with soil samples and my mind spinning with remediation strategies, I realized that everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. The man who had called my degree worthless was now trusting me with the survival of his company. The expertise he had dismissed as government overreach was now his only hope for avoiding financial and legal catastrophe. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in my relationship with Uncle Rick, I held all the power. He needed me more than I had ever needed his approval or acceptance. The question now was what I would do with that power, and whether I could use it to heal not just contaminated soil, but the damaged relationship between us. The work ahead would be technically challenging, legally complex, and emotionally fraught. But as I pulled into my apartment complex and saw my plants thriving in the desert sun, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years of family gatherings: excitement about the possibility of proving exactly how valuable my worthless degree could be. The first week of working on the Desert Vista Commons crisis taught me more about the construction industry than 4 years of environmental science coursework ever could. Rick's world operated on handshake deals, rushed timelines, and the assumption that problems could be solved with enough determination and heavy machinery. My world required documentation, regulatory approval, and methodical processes that couldn't be hurried no matter how much money was at stake. The clash between these two approaches became apparent during our first official project meeting on Wednesday morning. Rick had called together his core team: Jennifer, Tyler, his site foreman Carlos Mendez, and his project manager Elena Vasquez. I arrived with 3 binders of regulatory requirements, a laptop full of remediation case studies, and a presentation that outlined the 18-month timeline I had mentioned during the site visit. 18 months? Rick's voice cracked slightly as he stared at my timeline projection. Maya, I've got investors breathing down my neck, construction loans that are accruing interest every day, and 43 employees who need paychecks. We need to find a way to compress this schedule. I had expected this reaction, but it still stung to hear my professional assessment dismissed as unrealistic. Uncle Rick, environmental remediation isn't like construction where you can add more workers to finish faster, I explained, clicking to the next slide in my presentation. Soil contamination assessment requires sequential phases. We can't design a remediation system until we know the full extent of contamination. We can't get regulatory approval until we have a complete design. We can't implement remediation until we have all permits in place. Tyler leaned forward, his expression skeptical. But Maya, couldn't we at least start some of the work while we're waiting for permits? Maybe clean up the areas we know are contaminated while we're testing other areas. It was a reasonable question from someone who understood construction logistics, but not environmental regulations. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess, I replied, immediately regretting my harsh tone when I saw Rick's face tighten. I mean, environmental regulations exist to prevent exactly that kind of approach. If we start remediation without proper permits, we could face additional violations and penalties. Elena, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. Maya, help us understand what happens if we don't meet the EPA's 30-day deadline for submitting a remediation plan. Her question refocused the room on the immediate crisis rather than long-term timelines. The EPA can impose fines of $50,000 per day, starting 31 days after the initial notice. Those fines continue until we submit an acceptable plan. The math was simple and devastating. Even if we submitted a plan within 60 days, Thompson & Sons would face $1.5 million in additional penalties. If the plan wasn't acceptable on the first submission, the fines would continue accumulating while we revised and resubmitted. However, I continued, I believe we can get an extension if we demonstrate good faith efforts to address the contamination. Rick's expression shifted from despair to cautious hope. What kind of good faith efforts? I pulled up the emergency response plan I had been developing since Monday's site visit. Immediate cessation of all construction activities, installation of monitoring wells to track contamination migration, soil vapor extraction to prevent off-site contamination spread, and comprehensive site characterization to define the full extent of the problem. The plan I outlined would cost approximately $200,000 and take 6 weeks to complete, but it would demonstrate to the EPA that Thompson & Sons was taking the violations seriously and working toward a comprehensive solution. More importantly, it would buy us time to develop a full remediation strategy without accumulating daily fines. Jennifer had been taking detailed notes throughout the presentation. Maya, what do you need from us to get started on this emergency response plan? Her question cut through the gloom that had settled over the room, focusing everyone on actionable next steps rather than the overwhelming scope of the overall problem. I need authorization to hire specialized contractors for the monitoring, wells and vapor extraction system, I replied. I also need complete access to all historical site documentation, including any environmental reports or assessments that Thompson & Sons commissioned before purchasing the property. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I suspected there might be some gaps in the historical documentation. Maya, I need to be honest with you, Rick said, his voice carefully controlled. We may not have done as thorough environmental due diligence as we should have before buying the property. The previous owner said there had never been any industrial uses on the site, and we took him at his word. The admission explained a lot about how Thompson & Sons had ended up in this situation. Environmental due diligence was standard practice for any commercial property transaction, but it cost money and could delay closings. Rick had gambled that the site was clean based on the seller's representations, and that gamble had backfired spectacularly. Uncle Rick, did you at least get environmental warranties from the seller? Any kind of indemnification for unknown contamination? His silence answered my question before he spoke. The deal was structured as an all-cash purchase with minimal contingencies. We waived most of the standard protections to beat out competing offers. The implications were staggering. Not only was Thompson & Sons responsible for cleaning up contamination they didn't cause, but they had no legal recourse against the party who had actually created the environmental problem. I spent the rest of the meeting walking Rick's team through the immediate action items: contractor selection for the emergency response work, coordination with regulatory agencies, development of a community outreach plan to address neighbor concerns, and establishment of a dedicated project budget. That would be separate from the main construction financing. Each item represented a significant expense and administrative burden for a company that was already financially stressed. As the meeting broke up, Rick asked me to stay behind. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of our family history mixing with the professional crisis at hand. Finally, he spoke. Maya, I owe you an apology for what I said at Thanksgiving. I was wrong about your degree, wrong about environmental science, wrong about a lot of things. The apology was more than I had expected, but it felt incomplete, somehow, as if he was apologizing for being factually incorrect rather than for hurting me personally. Thank you for saying that, I replied carefully. But Uncle Rick, this isn't just about my degree or my career. It's about the way you've dismissed things you don't understand, the way you've made me feel like an outsider in my own family. He looked older suddenly, the stress of the past week etched in the lines around his eyes. I know I haven't always been supportive of your choices, Maya. I come from a generation where success meant building things with your hands, providing for your family through physical work. When you chose environmental science, I didn't understand how that could lead to a real career. It was the closest thing to an explanation I had ever gotten from Rick about his attitude toward my education and career choices. But now you're seeing that environmental science is real work that solves real problems, I said. Problems that can destroy businesses and cost millions of dollars if they're not handled properly. Rick nodded slowly. I'm learning that there's a lot I don't understand about the modern world. Environmental regulations, government oversight, scientific assessment. It's all foreign to me. But I'm starting to realize that my ignorance could cost me everything I've worked for. His vulnerability was startling, so different from the confident, dismissive man who had humiliated me at Thanksgiving dinner. The next few days blurred together in a flurry of contractor meetings, regulatory calls, and technical assessments. I found myself working 12-hour days, splitting time between my regular consulting clients and the Thompson & Sons crisis. The environmental contractors I hired were the best in Arizona, specialists in chlorinated solvent remediation who understood both the technical challenges and the regulatory requirements. Installing the monitoring wells required careful coordination with multiple agencies. The Arizona Department of Environmental Quality had to approve the well locations and sampling protocols. The city of Tucson required permits for any subsurface work near public utilities. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted assurance that the wells wouldn't impact protected wetlands. Each agency had different forms, different timelines, and different technical requirements. I spent an entire day at the EPA regional office in Phoenix, meeting with the project manager assigned to the Desert Vista Commons case. Maria Santos was a career environmental engineer who had seen dozens of contamination cases over her 20-year tenure with the agency. She was professional but skeptical, clearly wondering whether Thompson & Sons was genuinely committed to environmental compliance or just trying to minimize penalties. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed your emergency response plan and it appears technically sound, Maria said, reviewing the documents I had submitted. But I need to understand Thompson & Sons' long-term commitment to remediation. This isn't a problem that can be solved with a quick fix and some public relations. Her concern was understandable, given the EPA's experience with companies that promised comprehensive remediation, but then looked for shortcuts when costs mounted. Ms. Santos, I want to be completely transparent with you about the challenges we're facing, I replied. Thompson & Sons made mistakes in their initial site assessment, and they're now dealing with contamination that's more extensive than anyone anticipated. But they've hired me to ensure full regulatory compliance, and I have complete authority over all environmental aspects of this project. Maria's expression softened slightly. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed your background and your previous work on similar projects. Your reputation in the environmental consulting community is excellent. But ultimately, the EPA cares about results, not intentions. We need to see actual progress on contamination cleanup, not just promises and good faith efforts. I understood her position completely. The EPA dealt with contaminated sites across the Southwest, and they had limited patience for companies that discovered environmental problems and then claimed they couldn't afford to fix them properly. Ms. Santos, what would constitute acceptable progress in the EPA's view? What benchmarks would demonstrate that Thompson & Sons is meeting their remediation obligations? She pulled out a thick file folder labeled with the Desert Vista Commons case number. Quarterly progress reports showing measurable reduction in contamination levels. Compliance with all permit conditions and regulatory requirements. Demonstration that remediation activities are preventing further environmental damage. And most importantly, evidence that the company is investing adequate resources to complete the cleanup within a reasonable time frame. The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering every aspect of the remediation process from initial site characterization through final regulatory closure. By the time I left the EPA office, I had a clear understanding of what would be required to satisfy federal environmental authorities. I also had a sobering appreciation for the magnitude of the challenge facing Uncle Rick's company. The drive back to Tucson gave me time to process the day's conversations and plan my next moves. The emergency response plan was moving forward smoothly, with monitoring wells scheduled for installation the following week and the vapor extraction system being designed by specialists in soil remediation. But the long-term remediation strategy would require decisions that Rick might not be prepared to make. That evening, I called Jennifer to discuss the EPA meeting and its implications for Thompson & Sons. The bottom line is that we need to demonstrate measurable progress on contamination cleanup within the next 6 months, I explained. That means moving beyond emergency response to actual remediation activities, which will require significant financial investment. Jennifer's sigh was audible through the phone. Maya, I need to be honest with you about our financial situation. The Desert Vista Commons project represents about 60% of Thompson & Sons' current revenue. The construction loans are costing us $30,000 per month in interest, and we can't generate any income from the project until remediation is complete. The financial squeeze was even tighter than I had realized. Rick's company was burning cash on interest, payments while being prohibited from the construction activities that generated revenue. Even if we could complete remediation within 18 months, Thompson & Sons might not survive the financial pressure. Jennifer, has Rick considered bringing in additional investors or partners to help fund the remediation? He's exploring options, but most investors want to see a clear resolution timeline before they'll commit money, she replied. And honestly, Rick is struggling with the idea of giving up control of his company to outside investors. Thompson & Sons has been family-owned since he started it 23 years ago. I understood Rick's reluctance to dilute his ownership, but pride might be a luxury he couldn't afford given the circumstances. What about insurance coverage? Does Thompson & Sons have environmental liability insurance that might cover some of the remediation costs? Jennifer's pause suggested this was another area where Rick's cost-cutting might have created problems. We have general liability coverage, but it specifically excludes environmental contamination, she admitted. Rick always said environmental insurance was too expensive for the level of risk we thought we were taking on. Another gamble that had backfired, leaving Thompson & Sons completely exposed to the financial consequences of environmental problems. The conversation with Jennifer crystallized something that had been nagging at me since the project began. Rick's predicament wasn't just the result of bad luck or unforeseen circumstances. It was the predictable consequence of systematic decisions to cut corners on environmental protection, skip due diligence processes, and dismiss regulatory requirements as unnecessary government interference. Every shortcut Rick had taken to save money in the short term had created vulnerabilities that were now threatening to destroy his company. Skipping Phase 2. Environmental assessment had saved $20,000, but created a $2 million cleanup liability. Waiving environmental warranties had accelerated the property purchase, but eliminated legal recourse against the contamination source. Avoiding environmental insurance had reduced operating costs, but left the company with no financial protection against exactly the kind of crisis they now faced. The irony was that Rick's anti-regulatory philosophy had created the very situation that environmental regulations were designed to prevent. If Thompson & Sons had followed standard environmental due diligence practices, they would have discovered the contamination before purchase and either negotiated cleanup costs with the seller or walked away from the deal entirely. Over the weekend, I found myself reflecting on the deeper implications of Rick's situation. This wasn't just about one construction company's environmental problems or one family's interpersonal dynamics. It was about the collision between old-school business practices and modern environmental realities, between individual profit motives and collective environmental protection, between short-term cost savings and long-term sustainability. Rick represented a generation of business people who had built successful companies when environmental regulations were minimal and cleanup technologies were primitive. They had prospered in an era when the environmental costs of business activities were externalized to the broader community rather than internalized by the companies that created them. But that era was ending, and companies that failed to adapt were facing exactly the kind of crisis that threatened Thompson & Sons. My role in this situation was complicated by the personal history between Rick and me, but it was also representative of a broader generational and philosophical shift in how society thought about environmental protection. I represented not just technical expertise, but a different way of thinking about the relationship between business success and environmental responsibility. Monday morning brought news that changed the entire trajectory of the project. Jennifer called at 7:30, her voice tight with stress. "Maya, we have a problem. The Tucson Citizen is running a story tomorrow about the Desert Vista Commons contamination. Someone leaked information about the EPA violation and the extent of the soil contamination." Media attention was the last thing Thompson & Sons needed while trying to manage a complex environmental crisis. Public scrutiny would increase pressure from regulators, complicate relationships with investors and lenders, and potentially create legal exposure if any statements were misinterpreted or taken out of context. "Do we know who leaked the information?" I asked. though the answer might not matter at this point. The reporter won't reveal their source, but the information is very detailed and technically accurate, Jennifer replied. Whoever leaked it has access to our internal environmental reports and EPA correspondence. The implications were disturbing. Someone with inside knowledge of the project was actively working to damage Thompson & Sons' reputation and complicate their environmental response efforts. I spent the morning on crisis management calls with Rick's team, developing a media response strategy that would acknowledge the environmental challenges while emphasizing the company's commitment to comprehensive remediation. The key was to demonstrate responsibility and transparency without admitting legal liability or providing information that could be used against the company in potential litigation. Rick's reaction to the media leak revealed another dimension of his character that I hadn't seen before. Rather than lashing out at potential suspects or trying to suppress the story, he focused on how to respond constructively to public concerns about the contamination. Maya, what do people need to know to feel confident that we're handling this properly? He asked during our emergency strategy session. It was the right question, showing that Rick was beginning to understand that environmental problems were community issues that required community engagement. People need to know that the contamination is being contained, that it doesn't pose immediate health risks, and that cleanup is moving forward according to regulatory requirements, I replied. They also need to know that there's ongoing oversight by qualified environmental professionals. The media strategy we developed positioned me as the technical spokesperson for the project, with Rick handling business and financial questions. This arrangement played to our respective strengths, while protecting Rick from having to discuss technical environmental issues he didn't fully understand. It also gave me a platform to explain the science behind environmental remediation in terms that the general public could understand. The Tucson Citizen story ran on Tuesday morning with the headline, "Major Soil Contamination Discovered at Desert Vista Commons Development." The article was factually accurate but sensationalized, focusing on the potential health risks and financial implications rather than the remediation efforts already underway. The reporter had clearly done their homework, including quotes from environmental experts who weren't involved in the project, but could speak generally about chlorinated solvent contamination. What surprised me was Rick's reaction to seeing our family relationship mentioned in the story. Environmental consultant Maya Chen, who is heading the remediation effort, is the niece of Thompson & Sons owner Rick Thompson, the article noted. Chen's involvement in the project represents an ironic twist, given the construction industry's traditionally antagonistic relationship with environmental regulations. I had expected Rick to be angry about the family connection being publicized, but instead he seemed almost proud. Maya, this article makes it clear that we hired the best environmental consultant in Arizona to handle this problem, he said, showing me the newspaper over coffee that morning. It shows that we're taking this seriously and working with qualified professionals. The shift in Rick's attitude was remarkable. In less than 2 weeks, he had gone from dismissing environmental science as worthless to taking pride in my professional qualifications. The crisis had forced him to confront his preconceptions and acknowledge expertise he had previously dismissed. But I wondered whether this change would persist once the immediate crisis had passed, or whether it was simply pragmatic adaptation to circumstances beyond his control. The media attention also had unexpected positive consequences. 3 potential investors contacted Jennifer within hours of the story's publication, expressing interest in providing financial backing for the remediation project. Apparently, some investors saw distressed environmental situations as opportunities to acquire valuable real estate at below-market prices, assuming the contamination could be successfully cleaned up. One of these investors, a real estate development fund based in Phoenix, had extensive experience with environmental remediation projects. Their representative, David Kim, called me directly to discuss the technical aspects of the Desert Vista Commons cleanup. Ms. Chen, we've reviewed the public records related to this contamination, and we believe the remediation is feasible within reasonable time and cost parameters," he said. Would Thompson & Sons be interested in discussing a joint venture arrangement? The conversation with David Kim opened up possibilities that hadn't existed before the media coverage. His fund could provide the capital needed for comprehensive remediation, while Rick retained operational control of the construction project. It was exactly the kind of arrangement that could solve Thompson & Sons' financial pressures without forcing Rick to surrender ownership of his company. But as I prepared to present this opportunity to Rick, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. He was no longer the dismissive uncle who had humiliated me at Thanksgiving dinner. I was no longer the defensive niece seeking family approval. We had become professional partners working together to solve a complex problem, and that partnership was built on mutual respect for each other's expertise and contributions. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it wasn't complete. Rick still occasionally questioned my recommendations or suggested shortcuts that weren't environmentally acceptable. I still felt echoes of old resentment when he dismissed regulatory requirements as bureaucratic obstacles, but we had found a way to work together effectively despite our personal history and philosophical differences. More importantly, I had discovered something about myself through this crisis. I didn't need Rick's approval to validate my career choices or my professional competence. My degree wasn't worthless, regardless of what he had said at Thanksgiving dinner. My expertise was valuable, my work mattered, and I could succeed professionally without requiring acceptance from family members who didn't understand or appreciate what I did. The realization was both liberating and sobering. Liberating because it freed me from the need to prove myself to people whose opinions were based on ignorance rather than understanding. Sobering because it highlighted how much energy I had wasted over the years seeking validation from sources that were never going to provide it. As I prepared for the next phase of the Desert Vista Commons remediation project, I felt a sense of professional confidence and personal clarity that had been missing from my life for years. Uncle Rick might never fully understand or appreciate environmental science, but he had learned to respect my expertise and rely on my judgment. That respect had been earned through competence and results, not through family connections or personal relationships. The worthless degree he had mocked at Thanksgiving dinner was now the foundation of a solution that could save his company and restore a contaminated site to productive use. The environmental regulations he had dismissed as government overreach were now the framework within which we were developing a comprehensive remediation strategy. The expertise he had characterized as an obstacle to progress was now his pathway through the most serious crisis he had ever faced. The irony was complete, but more importantly, the lesson was learned. Environmental science wasn't worthless. It was essential. Regulatory compliance wasn't an obstacle. It was protection. And my career wasn't a disappointment. It was exactly what the world needed more of. The partnership proposal from David Kim's investment fund arrived on a Thursday morning in January, delivered by courier in a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with possibility. I was in my Phoenix office when Jennifer called to tell me it had been delivered to Thompson & Sons, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension that I had come to recognize as her default state during the Desert Vista Commons crisis. "Maya, you need to see this proposal," she said. "It's more comprehensive than anything we expected, and it addresses every concern Mr. Thompson raised about bringing in outside investors." I could hear papers shuffling in the background, and I imagined Jennifer at her desk, surrounded by the environmental reports, financial projections, and legal documents that had become the landscape of her daily work. The drive from Phoenix to Tucson had become routine over the past month, but today it felt different. The desert landscape that had once seemed monotonous now held a strange beauty. Saguaro cacti standing sentinel against mountains that changed color with the light. I found myself thinking about transformation, about how crisis could reshape not just business relationships, but entire ways of seeing the world. Rick was waiting in the conference room when I arrived, the partnership proposal spread across the table like a map of potential futures. He looked tired, but more hopeful than I had seen him since the EPA notice first arrived. Maya, I want you to walk through this proposal with me. I understand the business terms, but I need your opinion. On the environmental aspects, David Kim's fund was proposing to inject $4 million into the Desert Vista Commons project in exchange for a 40% ownership stake. The investment would cover all remediation costs, construction completion, and working capital needs during the cleanup phase. But what made the proposal particularly attractive was the fund's experience with environmental remediation projects and their willingness to take on the regulatory compliance risks. Look at Section 4, Rick said, pointing to a page dense with legal terminology. They're offering to indemnify Thompson & Sons against any additional environmental liabilities that might be discovered during remediation. That means if we find more contamination than we expect, their fund covers the extra costs. The risk transfer was significant, potentially saving Thompson & Sons millions if the cleanup proved more complex than current assessments suggested. I reviewed the environmental provisions carefully, noting the fund's commitment to full regulatory compliance and their requirement that all remediation work be overseen by qualified environmental professionals. Uncle Rick, this proposal actually strengthens the environmental management of the project. They're requiring quarterly environmental audits and independent oversight of all cleanup activities. What impressed me most was the fund's long-term perspective on environmental stewardship. Rather than viewing remediation as a necessary evil to be minimized, they saw it as an investment in the property's future value and community acceptance. The proposal included provisions for environmental monitoring that would continue for years after construction completion, ensuring that any residual contamination would be properly managed in perpetuity. Rick was studying the financial projections when Tyler arrived for the meeting, looking more serious than I had ever seen him. At 24, he had been groomed to eventually take over Thompson & Sons, but the environmental crisis had forced him to confront aspects of the construction business that he had never considered. Dad, I've been thinking about what this partnership would mean for the company's future, he said, settling into the chair across from Rick. The construction industry is changing, Tyler continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. Environmental compliance isn't optional anymore, and companies that don't adapt are going to face exactly the kind of crisis we're dealing with now. This partnership could teach us how to integrate environmental management into everything we do going forward. I was struck by Tyler's maturity and his willingness to acknowledge that Thompson & Sons needed to evolve. Unlike his father, Tyler had grown up in an era where environmental awareness was commonplace, where sustainability was seen as good business rather than regulatory burden. His perspective represented the future of the construction industry, and his support for the partnership carried weight that went beyond family dynamics. The meeting stretched into the afternoon as we worked through every aspect of the proposal. Jennifer took detailed notes while Rick peppered David Kim's representative with questions about decision-making authority, profit sharing, and exit strategies. But the most significant moment came when Rick asked me directly whether I thought the partnership was the right choice for both the environmental remediation and the company's long-term success. Uncle Rick, this partnership solves your immediate financial crisis and provides expertise that Thompson & Sons lacks, I said, choosing my words carefully. But more importantly, it positions your company to handle environmental challenges proactively, rather than reactively. That's going to be essential for survival in the modern construction industry. Rick nodded slowly, and I could see him weighing decades of independent operation against the reality of a business environment that demanded expertise he didn't possess. Maya, 6 months ago, I would have said that environmental consultants were parasites feeding off government overregulation. Now I'm realizing that environmental expertise might be the most valuable asset a construction company can have. The easier admission was remarkable coming from someone who had built his identity around self-reliance and skepticism of outside expertise. But Rick was learning what many business owners eventually discover: that success in complex industries requires collaboration with specialists whose knowledge complements rather than competes with your own core competencies. The partnership negotiations took 3 weeks to complete, involving lawyers, accountants, and environmental consultants from both sides. I found myself in the unusual position of representing Thompson & Sons' interests in discussions about environmental, liability and remediation oversight, drawing on technical expertise that had been dismissed as worthless just months earlier. David Kim proved to be as knowledgeable about environmental issues as he was about real estate finance. During one particularly complex discussion about long-term monitoring requirements, he demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of groundwater, hydrology, and contaminant transport that impressed even me. "Ms. Chen, we've learned that environmental due diligence isn't just about avoiding problems," he said. "It's about understanding opportunities that other investors miss because they're afraid of environmental complexity." His fund had made a business model out of acquiring contaminated properties, cleaning them up to regulatory standards, and developing them into valuable assets. They saw environmental remediation as a competitive advantage rather than a cost center, and their track record supported that philosophy. Over the past decade, they had successfully completed remediation and development projects worth over $200 million. The partnership agreement was signed on a Friday afternoon in February, with Rick, Tyler, Jennifer, and I gathered in the conference room where this journey had begun months earlier. David Kim attended via video conference from Phoenix, and the ceremony was more subdued than celebratory. Everyone understood that signing the partnership was just the beginning of a complex remediation and construction project that would take years to complete. Rick's handshake was firm when he thanked me for my role in negotiating the environmental aspects of the partnership. "Maya, I know this situation brought out some difficult family history between us, but I want you to know that having your expertise on our side made all the difference in getting through this crisis." The acknowledgement was more meaningful than any apology could have been. The remediation work began in earnest the following week, with specialized contractors mobilizing equipment that looked more like a small industrial operation than a construction site. Soil vapor extraction systems hummed constantly, pulling contaminated air from the subsurface and treating it before release to the atmosphere. Monitoring wells dotted the site like sentinels, providing continuous data on contamination levels and groundwater conditions. I found myself spending increasing amounts of time on site, overseeing the technical aspects of remediation while coordinating with the multiple regulatory agencies that had jurisdiction over different aspects of the cleanup. The EPA required monthly progress reports on soil contamination reduction. The Army Corps of Engineers monitored impacts to protected wetlands. The Arizona Department of Environmental Quality tracked groundwater quality improvements. Each agency had different reporting requirements, different technical standards, and different approval processes. Navigating this regulatory maze required not just technical expertise, but also political sensitivity and diplomatic skills that weren't taught in environmental science programs. I was learning that successful environmental consulting was as much about managing relationships as it was about managing contamination. The most challenging aspect of the remediation wasn't technical, but social. Neighbors living near the Desert Vista Commons development were understandably concerned about potential health risks from the contamination, and their concerns had been amplified by media coverage that emphasized the dangers of chlorinated solvents. Community meetings became regular events, with residents demanding detailed explanations of cleanup progress and long-term monitoring plans. Rick attended every community meeting, listening to concerns and questions with a patience that surprised everyone who knew his historically short temper. When one resident accused Thompson & Sons of putting profits ahead of public safety, Rick's response was measured and thoughtful rather than defensive. "Ma'am, you're absolutely right that we made mistakes in our initial site assessment," he said. "But we're committed to fixing those mistakes completely, regardless of cost, because this is our community too." The transformation in Rick's public persona was as dramatic as the transformation in our family relationship. The man who had once dismissed environmental regulations as government overreach was now citing EPA guidelines and discussing soil chemistry with the fluency of someone who had been forced to learn a new language. Crisis had been an effective teacher, and Rick had proven to be a surprisingly capable student. Tyler's role in the company evolved dramatically during the remediation phase. Rick began including him in all major decisions and giving him increasing responsibility for managing the environmental aspects of other Thompson & Sons projects. Tyler embraced this expanded role with enthusiasm, taking online courses in environmental management and attending industry conferences on sustainable construction practices. Maya, I want Thompson & Sons to become known as the construction company that gets environmental issues right, Tyler told me during one of our regular project updates. Not just in compliance terms, but in terms of actually improving environmental conditions through our work. His vision was ambitious but achievable, representing a fundamental shift in how the company thought about its relationship with the natural environment. The financial benefits of the partnership became apparent within the first quarter of remediation work. David Kim's fund absorbed all environmental costs without requiring Thompson & Sons to exhaust their credit lines or delay payments to subcontractors and suppliers. The company's cash flow stabilized, and Rick was able to bid on new projects for the first time since the Desert Vista Commons crisis began. More importantly, the partnership provided Thompson & Sons with access to environmental expertise that enhanced their competitive position on future projects. Other developers began seeking out the company specifically because of their demonstrated ability to handle complex environmental challenges. What had started as a crisis was becoming a competitive advantage. The technical success of the remediation was validated by quarterly monitoring results that showed steady improvement in soil and groundwater quality. Contamination levels were declining faster than regulatory agencies had expected, and the cleanup was proceeding ahead of schedule. The combination of vapor extraction, bioremediation, and hydraulic containment was proving highly effective for the specific types of contamination present at the site. I presented these results to the EPA during a scheduled progress review meeting, using charts and graphs to demonstrate that the remediation was meeting all regulatory benchmarks. Maria Santos, the EPA project manager, was clearly pleased with the progress. Ms. Chen, this is exactly the kind of comprehensive approach we like to see. Thompson & Sons is demonstrating genuine commitment to environmental stewardship. Her praise was professionally gratifying, but it also represented something more significant. The EPA's approval of our remediation approach validated the technical decisions I had made during the most challenging period of my career. Every recommendation I had fought for, every regulatory requirement I had insisted upon, every expensive safety measure I had demanded was proving its worth through measurable environmental improvement. Rick's learning curve during the remediation phase was steep but impressive. He began asking sophisticated questions about contaminant transport mechanisms and remediation effectiveness. He studied environmental reports with the same intensity he had once devoted to construction blueprints. He developed working relationships with regulatory officials that were based on mutual respect rather than adversarial positions. The change in Rick's vocabulary was particularly striking. Terms like hydraulic conductivity and biodegradation kinetics entered his regular conversation. He could discuss soil vapor extraction efficiency and groundwater monitoring protocols with the fluency of someone who had internalized complex technical concepts. The man who had called my degree worthless was becoming an environmental expert himself. But perhaps the most significant change was in Rick's attitude toward regulatory compliance. Instead of viewing environmental regulations as obstacles to be circumvented, he began seeing them as frameworks for responsible business practices. When Tyler suggested cutting corners on monitoring requirements to save money, Rick's response was immediate and firm. "Son, we do this right or we don't do it at all. Environmental compliance isn't negotiable." The partnership with David Kim's fund also exposed Thompson & Sons to new business opportunities in the growing market for environmental restoration and sustainable development. The fund's portfolio included several projects where contaminated industrial sites were being transformed into mixed-use developments that incorporated green building technologies and environmental restoration features. Rick began expressing interest in pursuing similar projects, seeing them as a way to differentiate Thompson & Sons from competitors who viewed environmental issues as problems rather than opportunities. Maya, I'm starting to think that environmental expertise might be our secret weapon in the construction industry, he said during one of our weekly progress meetings. Most contractors are still afraid of environmental complexity, but we're learning to embrace it. The irony of Rick's statement wasn't lost on me. The uncle who had dismissed environmental science as worthless was now viewing it as a competitive advantage. The expertise he had mocked was becoming the foundation of his company's strategic differentiation. The regulations he had resented were becoming the framework within which he built his reputation for environmental responsibility. Jennifer's role evolved as well, as she became Thompson & Sons' de facto environmental compliance coordinator. She tracked regulatory deadlines, coordinated with consulting firms, and managed the complex documentation requirements that accompanied every aspect of the remediation project. Her organizational skills and attention to detail were perfectly suited to the administrative demands of environmental management. Maya, I never thought I'd say this, but I actually enjoy the environmental compliance work, Jennifer told me during one of our coordination calls. It's complex and challenging, but there's something satisfying about knowing that we're actually making the environment cleaner through our work. Her enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, representing the kind of cultural change that would be necessary for Thompson & Sons to succeed in the evolving construction industry. The community response to the remediation progress was overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors who had initially been suspicious of Thompson & Sons' commitment to environmental cleanup became advocates for the company's approach. Property values in the surrounding area began to recover as the contamination was successfully addressed. Local environmental groups that had initially opposed the development began praising the comprehensive remediation effort. Rick's relationship with the community transformed along with everything else. He began attending city council meetings to discuss environmental issues, contributing to policy discussions about sustainable development practices. His voice carried weight because it was backed by first-hand experience with both the costs of environmental neglect and the benefits of environmental stewardship. The most rewarding aspect of the entire experience was watching Rick's relationship with environmental science evolve from dismissal to respect to genuine enthusiasm. By the end of the remediation phase, he was recommending environmental assessments for projects that didn't require them, investing in environmental training for his employees, and positioning Thompson & Sons as a leader in sustainable construction practices. The transformation was complete when Rick called me one evening to discuss a new project opportunity. A developer in Phoenix was looking for a construction company with environmental expertise to build a mixed-use development on a former industrial site. The project would require extensive environmental assessment and remediation, exactly the kind of work that Rick would have avoided in the past. Maya, I want Thompson & Sons to bid on this project, but only if you'll work with us as our environmental consultant, Rick said. I've learned that environmental expertise isn't just about avoiding problems, it's about creating opportunities. And I want you to be part of our team going forward. The invitation was more than a business proposition. It was Rick's acknowledgement that environmental science wasn't worthless, that my expertise was valuable, and that our partnership had benefits that extended far beyond crisis management. It was also his way of saying that our family relationship had evolved beyond the dismissive dynamics that had defined it for so many years. I accepted Rick's invitation, not because I needed his validation or approval, but because I had come to respect his willingness to learn and change. The man who had humiliated me at Thanksgiving dinner had become someone I genuinely enjoyed working with, someone whose commitment to environmental responsibility was authentic and sustainable. The Desert Vista Commons remediation project was completed successfully 18 months after it began, with soil and groundwater contamination reduced to levels that met all regulatory standards. The site was approved for unrestricted use, and construction of the mixed-use development resumed under the partnership between Thompson & Sons and David Kim's fund. The project that had nearly destroyed Rick's company became a model for environmental remediation and sustainable development. But the most important outcome wasn't the successful cleanup or the financial recovery, or even the community recognition. It was the fundamental shift in how Rick thought about environmental science and its role in responsible business practices. The worthless degree had become the foundation of a new approach to construction that prioritized environmental stewardship alongside economic success. 2 years after the Desert Vista Commons crisis first threatened to destroy everything Rick had built, I found myself standing in the same conference room where our professional partnership had begun. But this time, the atmosphere was celebratory rather than desperate. The Arizona Environmental Excellence Awards ceremony was being held at the Tucson Convention Center, and Thompson & Sons had been nominated in 3 categories for their groundbreaking work in environmental remediation and sustainable construction. Rick stood at the podium wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable on his construction-weathered frame, but his voice was steady and confident as he addressed an audience of environmental professionals, government officials, and industry leaders. 5 years ago, I would have told you that environmental consultants were the enemy of progress, he began, drawing knowing chuckles from the crowd. Today, I'm here to tell you that environmental expertise saved my company and taught me how to build a better business. The transformation in Rick's public speaking was remarkable. Gone was the defensive bluster that had characterized his interactions with regulatory agencies during the early stages of the crisis. In its place was a thoughtful confidence that came from genuine understanding of environmental issues and their business implications. He spoke about soil remediation techniques and groundwater monitoring protocols with the fluency of someone who had earned his expertise through experience rather than education. The environmental crisis at Desert Vista Commons could have bankrupted Thompson & Sons, Rick continued, his eyes finding mine in the audience. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most important business transformation we've ever undertaken. We learned that environmental stewardship isn't a cost of doing business. It's a competitive advantage that creates value for our clients, our community, and our bottom line. The applause was generous and sustained, reflecting not just approval of Rick's message, but recognition of the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. Many people in the audience had worked with Thompson & Sons during the remediation project, and they had witnessed firsthand the company's evolution from environmental liability to environmental leadership. Tyler joined his father on stage to accept the award for Outstanding Environmental Remediation Project, his presence symbolizing the generational change that was reshaping Thompson & Sons. At 26, Tyler had become the company's Director of Environmental Compliance, a position that hadn't existed before the Desert Vista Commons crisis, but was now central to every project the company undertook. This award belongs to everyone who believed that contaminated sites could be transformed into community assets, Tyler said, holding the crystal trophy that recognized their remediation work. But most importantly, it belongs to the environmental professionals who had the patience to teach us that doing things right is always better than doing them fast or cheap. His words carried a maturity that would have been impossible before. The crisis forced him to confront the long-term consequences of environmental neglect. Tyler had spent the past 2 years attending environmental conferences, completing coursework in sustainable construction practices, and building relationships with regulatory agencies. He represented the future of the construction industry, a generation that viewed environmental responsibility as fundamental rather than optional. Jennifer approached me after the ceremony, her usual professional composure softened by genuine emotion. Maya, I want you to know that working on the Desert Vista Commons project changed my life, she said. I never thought I'd become passionate about environmental compliance. But coordinating that remediation taught me that administrative work can actually make a meaningful difference in the world. Her transformation had been as dramatic as anyone's. The executive assistant who had once managed Rick's calendar and correspondence had become Thompson & Son's environmental documentation specialist, tracking regulatory compliance across multiple projects and serving as the company's primary liaison with environmental consultants and regulatory agencies. Her attention to detail and organizational skills had proven perfectly suited to the complex requirements of environmental management. The success at Desert Vista Commons had generated opportunities that none of us could have anticipated during the dark days of the EPA crisis. Thompson & Sons was now the preferred contractor for several developers who specialized in brownfield redevelopment, the transformation of contaminated industrial sites into productive community assets. Rick's company had found a profitable niche in the intersection of construction and environmental restoration. The financial results were impressive. Thompson & Sons' revenue had increased by 40% over the past 2 years, driven largely by environmental remediation and sustainable construction projects. More importantly, the company's profit margins had improved because their environmental expertise allowed them to manage risks that competitors couldn't handle. Projects that other contractors avoided because of environmental complexity became Thompson & Sons' specialty. David Kim's investment fund had been equally successful. The Desert Vista Commons development, once completed, had become a model for sustainable mixed-use development in the Southwest. The project incorporated green building technologies, native landscaping, and ongoing environmental monitoring that demonstrated how contaminated sites could be transformed into environmental assets. Property values in the development exceeded original projections, validating the fund's approach to environmental investing. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the shift in how the construction industry in Tucson approached environmental issues. Other contractors had watched Thompson & Sons' transformation with interest, and several had begun investing in environmental training and expertise. The crisis that had nearly destroyed one company had catalyzed positive change throughout the local construction industry. Rick's relationship with regulatory agencies had evolved from adversarial to collaborative. Maria Santos from the EPA now called him directly when difficult environmental issues arose on other projects, seeking his input on remediation strategies and community engagement approaches. The man who had once viewed the EPA as an enemy had become a trusted partner in environmental protection efforts. Rick Thompson has become one of our most effective advocates for voluntary environmental compliance, Maria told me during a recent conversation about industry trends. Other contractors listen when he talks about the business benefits of environmental stewardship because they know he learned those lessons the hard way. His credibility on environmental issues is unquestioned. The personal relationship between Rick and me had undergone its own transformation. We worked together regularly on Thompson & Sons' environmental projects, but our interactions were no longer colored by the family dynamics that had once made every conversation tense. We had developed mutual respect based on professional competence, rather than family obligation. Rick's apologies for his Thanksgiving dinner comments had evolved from grudging acknowledgement of error to genuine understanding of how his words had affected me. Maya, I need you to know that my attitude toward your career wasn't just wrong. It was harmful, he told me during one of our project planning meetings. I let my own insecurities about education and expertise turn into disrespect for knowledge that I should have valued. The admission was more meaningful than any formal apology could have been. Rick had come to understand that his dismissal of environmental science wasn't just factually incorrect, but personally hurtful. More importantly, he had learned to recognize the difference between confidence and arrogance, between practical experience and willful ignorance. My own career had flourished during the 2 years since the Desert Vista Commons project began. Rodriguez Sustainability Consulting had grown from a small firm into one of Arizona's leading environmental consulting companies, driven largely by referrals from satisfied clients like Thompson & Sons. The reputation I had built for solving complex environmental problems had attracted attention from developers, government agencies, and industrial companies throughout the Southwest. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the personal growth was more significant. The crisis had forced me to articulate the value of my expertise in terms that business leaders could understand and appreciate. I had learned to translate scientific complexity into business language, to present regulatory requirements as strategic opportunities, and to frame environmental protection as economic investment. More importantly, I had discovered that I didn't need validation from family members who didn't understand my work. My professional competence spoke for itself through results that were measurable and meaningful. The worthless degree that Rick had mocked at Thanksgiving dinner had become the foundation of expertise that created millions of dollars in value and prevented environmental disasters that could have affected entire communities. The Thanksgiving dinner that had started this entire journey felt like a distant memory, but its lessons remained relevant. Family relationships could be complicated by misunderstanding and prejudice, but they could also be transformed by crisis and growth. Rick's dismissal of my career had been painful, but it had also motivated me to prove the value of environmental science in ways that academic credentials alone could never demonstrate. Tyler's wedding took place in November, almost 3 years after the Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. The reception was held at Desert Vista Commons in the community center that had been built on the site where contaminated soil had once threatened to destroy Rick's company. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who understood the project's history. Rick's toast at the wedding reception was a masterpiece of personal reflection and professional acknowledgement. Tyler is marrying into a family that understands the importance of expertise and education, he said, raising his glass toward the bride's family. I've learned over the past few years that knowledge and experience come in many forms, and success requires the wisdom to recognize and respect expertise wherever you find it. He turned toward me at that moment, and his smile was warm and genuine. Maya, I want everyone here to know that you saved our family business and taught us lessons that go far beyond environmental science. You showed us that expertise isn't a threat to practical experience. It's a complement that makes practical experience more effective and more valuable. The acknowledgement was public and complete, witnessed by family members who remembered the harsh words that had been spoken at a different Thanksgiving gathering years earlier. But more importantly, it was authentic, reflecting Rick's genuine appreciation for knowledge that he had once dismissed as worthless. Ashley approached me after Rick's toast, her expression mixing pride and amusement. Maya, do you remember that Thanksgiving when Uncle Rick said your degree was worthless? She asked. I always thought he was wrong, but I never imagined he'd end up nominating you for environmental awards and praising you at family weddings. Her observation highlighted the complete reversal that had occurred in Rick's attitude toward environmental science and my career. The uncle who had humiliated me in front of the entire family had become my strongest advocate and most enthusiastic supporter. The transformation was so complete that it sometimes felt surreal, as if I was living in an alternate reality where environmental expertise was valued rather than dismissed. The business relationship between Thompson & Sons and my consulting firm had become a model for collaboration between contractors and environmental professionals. We worked together on every major project, integrating environmental considerations into planning processes from the beginning rather than treating them as afterthoughts or obstacles. The approach was more efficient, more cost-effective, and more successful than traditional adversarial relationships between construction and environmental interests. Rick's advocacy for environmental expertise extended beyond our family and business relationships. He began speaking at industry conferences about the business benefits of environmental compliance, sharing his story of transformation from skeptic to advocate. His presentations were popular because they came from someone who had learned environmental lessons through crisis rather than classroom instruction. environmental regulations aren't punishment for businesses that want to cut corners. Rick would tell audiences of contractors and developers, they're protection for businesses that want to do things right. The companies that embrace environmental expertise are the ones that will succeed in the modern construction industry. His message resonated with industry professionals who faced similar challenges in navigating environmental requirements. Rick's credibility on the subject was unquestioned because everyone knew his conversion to environmental advocacy had been earned through experience rather than ideology. He had learned to respect environmental science because ignoring it had nearly cost him everything. The Desert Vista Commons development became a showcase for sustainable construction practices and environmental restoration. The site that had once been contaminated with industrial chemicals was now home to energy-efficient buildings, native landscaping, and groundwater monitoring systems that ensured long-term environmental protection. Visitors often commented on the irony that the environmental crisis had resulted in a development that was more environmentally responsible than it would have been without the contamination. The project's success attracted attention from environmental organizations, government agencies, and academic institutions. The University of Arizona's Environmental Science program began using Desert Vista Commons as a case study in successful environmental remediation, and several graduate students conducted research projects on the site's transformation from liability to asset. My involvement with the university's environmental program led to opportunities for guest lectures and consulting projects that kept me connected to the academic aspects of environmental science. Teaching students about real-world applications of environmental principles was rewarding in ways that commercial consulting couldn't match. The students' enthusiasm for environmental protection reminded me why I had chosen this career path in the first place. But the most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was the knowledge that environmental science had proven its worth through practical application rather than theoretical argument. The worthless degree that Rick had mocked had saved his company, created jobs, protected public health, and demonstrated that environmental expertise was essential for business success in the modern economy. The annual Thanksgiving dinner at Rick and Carol's house had become a celebration of family success, rather than a source of tension and anxiety. Rick made a point of asking about my latest projects and sharing news about Thompson & Sons' environmental initiatives. The conversations that had once been strained and dismissive were now engaging and collaborative. Tyler's children, when they arrived, would grow up in a family that valued education and expertise. They would hear stories about how Aunt Maya's environmental knowledge had saved the family business and created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. They would learn that knowledge and practical experience were complementary rather than competitive, and that success required both technical expertise and business acumen. The transformation in Rick's attitude toward environmental science had ripple effects throughout the extended family. Other relatives began asking me about environmental issues affecting their own businesses and communities. The niece, who had once been dismissed as pursuing an impractical career, became the family expert on issues ranging from water quality to energy efficiency to waste management. Jennifer's evolution from executive assistant to environmental compliance specialist had inspired other administrative professionals in the construction industry to develop expertise in environmental management. She began teaching workshops for industry associations, sharing her knowledge of regulatory requirements and compliance strategies with other companies that were struggling to navigate environmental challenges. The success story of Thompson & Sons' environmental transformation was documented in several industry publications and academic case studies. The company that had once viewed environmental regulations as obstacles had become a model for integrating environmental expertise into construction operations. The transformation was studied by business schools as an example of successful organizational change in response to external crisis. Rick's journey from environmental skeptic to environmental advocate became a powerful narrative about the possibility of change and growth, even in the face of deep-seated beliefs and long-established practices. His willingness to acknowledge error, learn from experts, and embrace new approaches to business challenges inspired other industry leaders to reconsider their own attitudes toward environmental issues. The Desert Vista Commons project was completed 5 years after the initial contamination discovery, and the development became one of Tucson's most successful mixed-use communities. Property values exceeded projections, businesses thrived in the commercial spaces, and residents took pride in living in a development that demonstrated environmental responsibility. The site that had once threatened to destroy Rick's company had become the foundation of its greatest success. My own reflection on the journey from Thanksgiving dinner dismissal to industry recognition revealed lessons about resilience, expertise, and the power of crisis to catalyze positive change. The painful experience of having my career dismissed by a family member had motivated me to prove the value of environmental science in ways that academic achievements alone could never accomplish. The worthless degree had become the foundation of expertise that created measurable value for businesses, communities, and the environment. The government overreach that Rick had once resented had become the regulatory framework that guided responsible business practices. The obstacles that environmental regulations had once represented had become opportunities for competitive advantage and market differentiation. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the possibility of transformation and redemption in human relationships. Rick's journey from dismissal to advocacy wasn't just about learning environmental science. It was about learning to respect knowledge that challenged his preconceptions and to value expertise that came from sources he hadn't previously trusted. The family dynamics that had once been characterized by dismissal and resentment had evolved into mutual respect and collaborative partnership. The uncle who had called my degree worthless had become my strongest advocate and most enthusiastic supporter. The relationship that had been damaged by ignorance and prejudice had been healed by crisis and growth. Standing in my Phoenix office on a quiet Friday afternoon, surrounded by environmental reports and regulatory documents that represented ongoing projects throughout Arizona, I felt a sense of professional accomplishment and personal satisfaction that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days when the EPA notice first arrived at Thompson & Sons. The phone rang, and Jennifer's familiar voice carried news of another environmental challenge that required Thompson & Sons to partner with experienced consultants. Maya, we have a new project in Flagstaff that involves some complex groundwater issues. Mr. Thompson specifically requested that we work with your firm on the environmental aspects. Can you meet with us next week to discuss the scope of work? The call was routine but significant, representing the ongoing collaboration that had emerged from crisis and transformed both our businesses and our family relationships. The expertise that had once been dismissed as worthless was now essential to Thompson & Sons' continued success. The environmental science that had been characterized as government overreach was now the foundation of competitive advantage in the construction industry. I accepted the project and began reviewing the preliminary site information that Jennifer would send over the weekend. The work was challenging but familiar, involving the same types of environmental assessment and regulatory coordination that had become my specialty. But more importantly, it represented the continuation of a partnership that had been forged in crisis and strengthened through success. The worthless degree had proven its worth through results that were measurable and meaningful. The family member who had dismissed my expertise had become my strongest professional advocate. The environmental crisis that had threatened to destroy a family business had become the catalyst for growth and transformation that benefited everyone involved. Rick Thompson had learned that environmental science wasn't worthless. It was essential. I had learned that expertise earned through competence was more valuable than approval sought through accommodation. And together, we had learned that crisis could be transformed into opportunity through the willingness to acknowledge error, embrace change, and respect knowledge wherever it was found. The story that had begun with dismissal and humiliation at a Thanksgiving dinner had evolved into a narrative of professional success, family reconciliation, and environmental protection. The uncle who had called my degree worthless now proudly introduced me as the environmental expert who had saved his company and taught him that knowledge and experience were most powerful when they worked together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.